Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Let's come to chapter 7 of our Problems in International Politics lectures we saw last week when we had a look at the European Union as an international actor. We saw that, or at least I felt free to claim that when it comes to major crises, it is not the European Union personified in the president of the European Council or the president of the European Commission or the lesser or even the high representative of foreign affairs who is acting, but it is either France and Germany, the most powerful nations, member states within the European Union, to put it differently. And the example I gave, the illustration, the empirical illustration I chose was Hollande and Merkel organizing peace talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians in order to try to find a solution to this Ukrainian crisis. And it is precisely the Ukrainian crisis that we will have a look at today in our chapter 7. This crisis that broke out 7 years ago in November 2013, and it broke out to some extent as an indirect consequence of the European Union's attitude or behavior or objectives. So how can we explain this topic? How can we explain this Ukrainian crisis and actually this Ukrainian-Russian conflict that caused the death of a bit more than 13,000 victims? Is this crisis, which is the first major war in Europe on the European continent since the end of the war that broke out in the 1990s among former Yugoslavian entities. The last war up to 2 or 3 weeks ago, when a military confrontation still is opposing Armenia to Azerbaijan regarding the province, the territory, the entity of Nagorno-Karabakh. So what is this major war due to? Is it the proof of Russia's expansionist behavior, as is pretty often the analysis put forward in Western media? Is it the proof that international politics basically is consisting in power politics? Or are Western leaders, Western politicians, and Western media and NGOs right when they claim that it is a temporary return of some kind of old-fashioned geopolitical behavior? So it is to these questions that I would like to try to provide some tentative answers. And in order to do so, as usual, I will refer to international relations theories. International relations theories or theories put forward in the discipline of international relations that are likely to permit us to better understand even the immediate domestic reasons of the Ukrainian crisis. So I will first look at these domestic origins, and then I will broaden my perspective in order to include the behavior of foreign powers, that is to say, first and foremost, Russia, of course, but also the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So let's begin with the starting point of the contemporary conflict. It broke out in November 2013. The domestic troubles broke out in November 2013, a little bit less than 7 years ago. The immediate origin of these troubles, the triggering event to some extent, was the economic agreements, the fate of the economic agreements that the then Ukrainian president Yanukovych, I don't know how to pronounce this exactly, anyway, was supposed to sign with the European Union. And he changed his mind. Yanukovych changed his mind. He suspended the negotiations with the European Union regarding this economic agreement. Why? Because he preferred to accept an offer by Putin, by Russia, who offered the Ukrainian economy a $15 billion loan, euro loan. This decision to put an end to the negotiations with Europe, the European Union, this decision was rejected by a significant part of the Ukrainian population, more specifically by the population, I'll come back to this point, of the western part of the Ukraine, who launched a protest movement. The protest movement, which is called the protest movement of Maidan, which then was later called the protest movement of Euro Maidan. Listen to the presentation of what happened 7 years ago. It is a video of the Wall Street Journal.
In the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, a multi-day opposition rally continued Monday as thousands protested President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to abandon a planned trade pact with the European Union and focus instead on ties with Russia. Several hundred protesters clashed with riot police outside a main government building. Police fired tear gas after they said protesters threw a smoke bomb. In recent months, Russia has imposed trade restrictions on Ukraine and threatened dire economic consequences if Kiev were to sign the EU deal. Russia wants the Ukraine to join a rival trade bloc of former Soviet states in an effort to maintain Moscow's influence in the region. The Kiev rally is the largest since Ukraine's pro-Western Orange Revolution in 2004, which brought Yanukovych's rival Yulia Tymoshenko to the prime ministership. Tymoshenko has been jailed on what many believe were politically motivated corruption charges since 2011, and one of the conditions for Ukraine's EU membership was her release. Ukrainian officials say they are still pursuing closer EU ties, but can't risk the damage worse relations with Russia would cause for its recession-stricken economy.
So this protest movement, of course, how did Yanukovych's regime react? As usual, might I say, typical reaction of an autocratic regime or of a democratically elected but not completely legitimate regime. It chose repression against the protesters, just as the northern neighbor nowadays is doing, the northern neighbor of Ukraine, Belarus, Lukashenko is doing this, has been doing these last weeks or so. So he chose to repress the protesters, and thus he contributed to transform the protest movement into a more general movement against his own government, against the regime, against the repressive and corrupt nature of the regime. And the protest movement ended up being successful because, notwithstanding the political repression, Yanukovych was forced to flee in February 2014, so some 3 months after the beginning of the upheaval. He was forced to flee. He went to Moscow, logically, on February 21st, 2014. A provisional government was formed in the weeks following his escape. A provisional government by revolutionary means, that is to say, in violation of the then Ukrainian constitution. And this new government was composed almost exclusively by politicians identified with the Western nationalist regions of Ukraine. And of course, as a kind of logical consequence of this evolution, a significant part of the eastern population in Ukraine rejected this new government. Populations in the south, southeast, and above all the eastern part of Ukraine did not want to accept this new government. This was first the case, ladies and gentlemen, in Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean Peninsula, you may know that, is populated by Ukrainians of Russian ethnic origin and not of Ukrainian ethnic origins. You know that Ukrainians, just as the Russians, just as Belarusians, are part of the Slavic nations, and the Eastern Slavic nations, to be distinguished from the Western Slavic nations, that is to say, the people of Poland, of the Czech Republic, of Slovakia mainly, and the Southern Slavic populations, that is to say the Serbs or the Serbians, the Croatians, and the Slovenians mainly, and Bulgarians mainly. So the people living in the eastern part of Ukraine are of Russian ethnic origin, not of Ukrainian ethnic origin. And this is due to the fact that Crimea had been conquered in 1783 by the then Russian Tsarina Catherine the Great, because it had been part of the former Ottoman Empire. And during Russia's southward expansion towards the Caucasus, the region located between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the Caucasus region was conquered, and Crimea became part of the then Tsarist Russia. It remained part of the Soviet Russian Socialist Republic until the beginning of the 1950s, when Khrushchev, the midst of the 1950s, when Khrushchev decided to transfer it to the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic in the then Soviet Union. He decided to transfer Crimea. It was a kind of gift given by Khrushchev to Ukraine in order to try to compensate for the many Ukrainian victims during the Stalinist terror regime of the end of the 20s, end of the 30s, when the forced collectivization of the Soviet agriculture had resulted in the death of millions of Ukrainian landowners and Ukrainian peasants. So it was a kind of compensation. When then Ukraine became independent in 1991, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, after the definitive collapse of the Soviet Union after the Cold War, Crimea remained Ukrainian by definition. And ever since 1991, it was part of the new independent Ukraine. Given, however, that the majority of, actually more than 90% of the people are of Russian ethnic origin, they did not want this new Ukrainian government. So what did Putin do? He supported the protest movement in Crimea, all the more so since Sevastopol is the harbor where the Black Sea fleet of Russia, former Soviet Union, now of Russia, is located. And he decided that Russia should annex the Crimean Peninsula as a part of Russia and no more a part of Ukraine. Listen to Putin's justification of his decision to annex Crimea.
With the stroke of a pen, Russia defied protesters in Kiev, minorities in Crimea, and leaders across the Western world. The audience gave a standing ovation. Just before the signing ceremony, both chambers of parliament met in the Kremlin to hear Vladimir Putin's vision for the future of Crimea. He used the speech as another opportunity to justify Russia's actions in Crimea. And he highlighted the region's history and mutual importance to Moscow.
Crimea is about Sevastopol, a legendary city, the city of great destiny, the city of fortresses, and the Russian Black Sea Fleet.
His message soon turned into an indictment of the West. NATO's eastward expansion, its involvement in Libya, and the conflict in former Yugoslavia. Time and again, Putin said, the West has forced confrontation with Russia.
In the case of Ukraine, our Western partners have crossed a red line. In this instance, Russia has legitimate interests that must be recognized.
Putin praised the Ukrainian soldiers in Crimea for not turning the dispute into an armed conflict. The Kremlin does not recognize the new government in Kiev, but Putin said Russia's relations with Ukraine are extremely important and would remain so.
We don't want a breakup of Ukraine, but Crimea will remain Russian. Crimea is Russia's most strategically important factor in the region.
After signing the treaty, Putin greeted supporters in Moscow's Red Square, saying Crimea was returning home. The Kremlin says the treaty comes into effect immediately, but it lays out a period until the end of the year to formalize the annexation of Crimea.
So this annexation took place in March 2014 after a referendum organized in Crimea with a huge majority, of course, in favor of its annexation to Russia. So the new government in Ukraine was rejected in Crimea. It was also rejected in the eastern part, a specific region in the eastern part of Ukraine, the so-called Donbas region, where a part of the population, also of Russian ethnic origin, copied to some extent the Maidan protest movement by staging actions against the new government, by occupying governmental buildings, by calling for a referendum in order to become independent and actually in order to join Russia. The new government, of course, in Ukraine could not accept to lose another part of its territory after losing Crimea. And so it also resorted to political repression of this movement. All the more so, it, rightly so, of course, suspects the Kremlin, that is, Putin, to support by weapons, by money, and even by soldiers, the separatist movement in the Donbas region. Nothing changed after the election of the new Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, a typical Ukrainian oligarch. We come back to this. The specificity of the Ukrainian, also the Russian, but above all the Ukrainian political regime. No serious negotiations started. And therefore, of course, Putin went on sending indirectly, of course, without admitting this, troops, Russian troops, to the Donbas region. He also provided weapons to the rebels, and specifically surface-to-air missiles, permitting to down the Ukrainian bombers, the Ukrainian aircraft. And it is such a surface-to-air missile which probably brought down a civilian airliner, Flight 17 of the Malaysian airliner in the summer of 2014. Anyway, the power ratio between the two camps was somehow equal, so a stalemate occurred, was the result, a kind of a ceasefire, since nobody was able to definitely win this armed confrontation, and the ceasefire is going on ever since then, roughly for 6 years now, summer 2014 up to nowadays. A ceasefire which nevertheless, as I already said, was synonymous with the death of more than 13,000 people. Nothing changed since the election of a new Ukrainian president, former local TV hero, Volodymyr Zelensky. Listen to his presentation by the British Sky News channel.
Volodymyr Zelensky arrived to his inauguration on foot. The crowds delighted with the man they've known for years as a comic touch on their TV screens. He stopped for selfies and high fives, jumping to kiss members of the public. True man of the people style stuff. The crowds chanting Zelensky as he took to the red carpet and strode with panache through the parliament. All the traditional trappings of office, but an untraditional approach to politics, starting off with a rebuke to MPs.
My election only proves that the citizens are tired of the experienced politicians who, over the past 28 years, created a country of opportunities to steal, bribe and loot.
President Zelensky has made ending the war in Ukraine's east his priority. He has promised to restart dialogue with Russia on releasing Ukrainian prisoners, including the 24 sailors currently behind bars in Moscow. Russia is adopting a sit-back-and-wait approach. The Kremlin said today that Vladimir Putin would not send any congratulations until Ukraine's new president had proven his first successes in resolving the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And Mr. Zelensky will be hard-pressed to compel the Kremlin to change the status quo there. For now, his battle is closer to home. There will be snap elections this summer. The new president needs parliamentary seats, and he'll be looking to capitalize on his popularity before it starts to fade.
Dear nation, throughout my life, I've been trying to do everything I can to make Ukrainians smile. I felt with my heart that it wasn't just my job, it was my mission. In the next 5 years, I will do everything so that you, Ukrainians, don't cry. Thank you.
The man who starred in a hit TV show as a history teacher turned president, now inaugurated into the role for real. Diana Magnay, Sky News.
So Zelensky's mission, as he said himself, is to make Ukrainians smile, or at least to prevent them from crying. Ever since he became president, so a bit more than 1 year ago, 1.5 years ago, the only progress regarding the Ukrainian-Russian conflict was an exchange of prisoners 1 year ago, and nothing else for the last 12 months. So long, ladies and gentlemen, through these empirical concrete events, from these events, we can draw, we can infer, deduce a first general hypothesis. The origin of the existing crisis is a domestic. It is a domestic crisis. The roots of the conflict are domestic causes, but of course, outside interventions from interferences from outside powers, Russia and the European Union and NATO also constitute a secondary important factor. So let's look first at the domestic origin of this crisis, of this conflict. The first thing that we have to, I think, emphasize is that Ukraine is a very deeply divided society. If you look at documents 1 and 2, the maps that I put on the file that you can find on Moodle, you will see that Ukraine is divided along lines of language, religion, culture, historical memory, historical identity, economic wealth, and in general, I would say attitudes towards Russia and even beyond Russia to the rest of the world. So first of all, roughly 50% of the Ukrainian population speaks Ukrainian. The other 50% speaks Russian in its everyday life. Both halves do speak the other one's language. The population in the western half of the western half of the Ukraine is Western-oriented, deeply nationalistic. And I would say that the most important characteristic of this nationalist feeling is a kind of fear mixed with hatred of Russia. The eastern populations, the eastern and southern populations, have strong ethnic and cultural ties with Russia, political sympathies too, economic links. We'll come back to this. The situation in the center, and therefore also in the capital, Kiev, is somehow mixed. Historical memory plays a pretty important role. Why? For the very simple reason that the heroes cherished in the West pretty often were collaborating with Nazi occupiers during World War II. And they also participated in the crimes of the Nazi regarding the way they treated Jews, Gypsies. But these Ukrainians who collaborated with the Nazi regime also did this in order to take their revenge for what had happened. I already mentioned this, for what had happened during the Stalinist terror regime of the end of the 20s and the 30s in Ukraine, where millions of people either starved to death or were consciously eliminated, killed by Stalin's terror regime, when the agriculture was put under the control of the Soviet command economy. The heroes, of course, of the East and the South were those who took part to the Great Patriotic War. This is how Stalin called World War II, against the Nazis, those who fought against fascism. And this is the reason why nowadays still some Ukrainians consider other Ukrainians to be fascists or neo-fascists, and accused members of this party to be part of the government that profited from the first months of upheaval to come to power in December 2013, January, February 2014. So almost every major historical event, every major historical figure, there is no agreement among Ukrainians regarding any historical event, any historical person of the Ukrainian history. And this is somehow similar, if we should try to make a comparison with what had happened in Yugoslavia, in former Yugoslavia during the 1990s between the Soviets and the Croatians. These divisions, so somehow objective, nation, nationality, ethnic origin, language, religion, culture, identity. These divisions, ever since Ukraine became independent in 1991, were manipulated to some extent by the elite, by the corrupt political and economic elites. The aim of these elites was, of course, to distract populations, to divert the populations from both their criminal activities and from the economic decline of Ukraine, economic widespread poverty. And this is the reason why whoever became member of the Ukrainian governments for the last 30 years or now, and there is an allusion in Zelensky's speech when he said that the Ukrainian people are fed up with professional politicians. This explains that whoever was part of the government, whoever won the elections, they very quickly lost any legitimacy in the eyes of the majority of the population, be it the western part of the population or the eastern part of the population. So there is a kind of ruling class in Ukraine composed by the so-called oligarchs who run the economy for their own personal private profit. So they do enrich themselves fantastically, but the rest of the population is getting poorer and poorer. Oligarchs also exist in Russia. So this is the common point between the two states. But Russia is what we political scientists call a Bonapartist regime. Bonapartist from Napoleon Bonaparte, of course. That is to say, the political elite in Russia. It was true under Yeltsin in the 1990s. It has been true ever since Putin came to power for more than 2 decades now, if we take into account the period of Medvedev being president and Putin prime minister. So Russia oligarchs exist, but they are submitted to the political authority, to Putin's authority. So Putin is the boss. He serves the interests of the oligarchs, at least of those oligarchs who accept the regime. Those who do not accept are, of course, running risks for their own life. So the political authority is superior to the economic caste composed by the oligarchs. And to some extent, the opposite is true in the Ukrainian regime. In Ukraine, the oligarchs control the political regimes, and they also control, of course, the economy, and they control the media. So there is a kind of pluralism in Ukraine because of the rivalry among the different oligarchs. But this pluralism is absolutely absent in Russia. But the problem in Ukraine is that the oligarchs are corrupt and politically anything but able to govern correctly a state. So they lose their legitimacy as soon as they come to power. This is what happened after the so-called Orange Revolution. An allusion to this revolution was made in the first video that you heard. When Yulia Tymoshenko came to power, she was also the hero of the West, but after some months or so, she ended up, at least this is what she was accused of, she ended up being as corrupt as any other Ukrainian political leader. So, a political regime characterized by political incompetence of whatever leader, of whatever policymaker. Economically speaking, Ukraine is divided too among the more industrial East, which has close economic links to Russia. It is even indirectly integrated to Russian economy. This was due to the Soviet economy, when heavy industries were located in the eastern part of the Ukraine. The western part of the Ukraine is more rural, more agricultural, agrarian, small towns, and it is exporting its goods to the West. The vast majority, I already said this, of the Ukraine population is pretty poor. Ukraine lost 13% of its population. It is committed in a demographic decline. It went down to 44, from more than 50 million people to 44, if we include the Crimea and Sevastopol, if we take into account the fact that these two territories no longer belong to Ukraine. It actually, the population went down to less than 42 million people. And a lot of people, a lot of Ukrainians are compelled to flee in order to find a job either in Russia or in Western Europe, and first and foremost in Germany. So if we take all these divisions together, if we add the cultural divisions, plus the economic poverty, plus the political responsibility or actually absence of responsibility of the governing elites, then we can come to the conclusion that Ukraine forms a non-security community, a non-security community. The term security community was coined in the 50s. We already used this term when analyzing NATO's nature as a security community rather than as an alliance. The term security community was coined in the 1950s by the American scholar of Czech origin, Karl Deutsch, in his book called Political Community and the North Atlantic Area, and then his analysis were updated by constructivist scholars such as Emmanuel Adler and Michael Barnett. The aim of all these scholars was to look at why, both among states, independent states, and within states, it is an approach which does not posit the radical difference between foreign policy, international affairs on the one hand, domestic policy, domestic politics, or domestic society on the other hand. So according to these authors, who are interested in studying why and when peace is possible, these authors coined the expression security community, when precisely peace was prevailing, peace rather than the risks of war. So what is a security community? A security community is a group of people, I quote, which has become integrated, a group of people which has become integrated, and integration then means, I quote, the attainment within a territory, either more than one state, various states, or within a state, the attainment, the achievement, if you prefer, within a territory of a sense of community. There is a sense of community strong enough widespread enough to guarantee expectations of peaceful change. Expectations of peaceful change. That is to say, the populations living on said territory be the populations of different states, and therefore NATO is such security community, or within one state. Therefore, we can apply it to one state, single unit, in this case, Ukraine. The population living in such a territory has internalized the conviction that conflicts in the neutral meaning of divergent interests, clashing interests, divergent aspirations, the population has internalized the conviction that these conflicts should and can be resolved peacefully. So they can have peaceful expectations regarding the future behavior of all the populations. No resort to violence, no more resort to large-scale physical force. If there is no more such resort to force, if there is a conviction that conflicts can be resolved by peaceful means, then a security community is existing. If then we apply, ladies and gentlemen, this concept to our Ukraine, obviously there is precisely no such sense of community. There is no such internalized conviction that the conflicts that may arise should and can be resolved peacefully. Why did the western part of the Ukrainian population resort to the protest movement called Maidan after Yanukovych's decision to put an end to the economic agreement with the European Union? Because it resorted to protests, because it did not believe in the possibility of a dialogue permitting to find a compromise with the then Ukrainian government. Why did the eastern part of the Donbas region resort to violence in order to oppose its opinion to the new Ukrainian government composed by politicians from the West? Because it did not believe that dialogue would permit them to obtain satisfaction. There is no security community. Ukraine does not form a security community. There are no peaceful expectations for change among the different members of the Ukraine. And to have an idea of what a security community concretely consists in, we just have to compare to what happened, for instance, in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom. You know that in the United Kingdom, a fairly significant part of the Scottish population is tempted by independence. There is a nationalist party in Scotland eager to obtain the independence of Scotland from the rest of Great Britain. What does this Scottish independence movement do? It does not resort to weapons, to arms, to physical violence. It asked in 2014, and it obtained from the British government, it asked a referendum. It asked a referendum because it knew that in the case this referendum was successful, the then British government in London would accept this, the result of the referendum. And the then British Prime Minister Cameron accepted to organize a referendum, or accepted that Scotland should organize such a referendum, because it knew that in the case of the independentist or secessionist, you call it as you like it, movement of Scotland being defeated, not reaching a majority of 50%, Cameron knew that this Scottish independence movement would accept its defeat. In other words, both parties, the Scottish independentists and the British government, agreed upon peaceful expectations of change. They accepted, they knew that everybody else would accept the result of this referendum. And this is what happens. The majority of Scottish voters refused independence, and the minority of those who were in favor of the Scottish independence accepted their defeat. And I think that in the case of the nowadays Prime Minister of Scotland, Mrs. Nicola Sturgeon, she's eager to organize a new referendum, all the more so since the COVID pandemics. In the case of organization, in the case of a new referendum being organized, we can bet that exactly the same conclusion will occur. That is to say, whatever the result, both parties, those who are favorable and those who are not favorable to independence, would accept the result of such a referendum. The same is true in Canada. In Canada, the French-speaking Quebec province is regularly tempted to get rid of the rest of Canada to become an independent state. Two referendums were organized in 1980, in 1995. In 1980, 59% of the people, the voters of Quebec, rejected independence. In 1995, less than 51%, so a very small majority rejected independence. That is to say, accepted to go in being part of Canada. And the minority, almost majority, but nevertheless the minority of independentists from Quebec accepted to go on to remaining a part of a province within Canada. Also thanks to, of course, a federal constitution, which permits very important autonomy to the French-speaking Canadian living in Quebec. A federal constitution, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly what Putin proposes in order to find a solution to the Ukrainian crisis, to the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, in order to get out of the contemporary deadlock, the contemporary stalemate. A federal constitution. We thus come to the external dimension of the conflicts, of the crisis, the external dimension, which regards, of course, the behavior of Russia first and foremost, but also of the European Union and of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So let's have a look at the behavior of the foreign powers directly or indirectly concerned by what is happening in Ukraine. Chronologically speaking, I come back to historical events, to empirical events. Chronologically speaking, regarding the immediate triggering event that provoked the outbreak of the Ukrainian crisis, the immediate event was, I already mentioned this, the proposal made by the European Union to aid economically and financially Ukraine. And Yanukovych decided to stop the negotiations and to prefer Putin's proposal to give him 15 billion euros. So the immediate triggering event was the attitude of the European Union to some extent, the proposal. So I would dare to say that the European Union somehow was responsible. I say responsible and not guilty. Responsible of what happened in 2013. Why responsible? Because on the one hand, it is somehow normal, logical for Europe, for the European Union, to make such a proposal in its neighborhood. That is to say, to attract those states that are not yet members of the European Union. We saw this last week. The European Union is bound to prosper thanks to the so-called spillover effect. The spillover effects regarding its functional dimension, more and more sectors, from the coal and steel industry to agriculture to the common European currency called the euro. There is a functional spillover, more and more sectors are integrated, and there is a geographical spillover from the 6 original founding members of the then European Community. The European Union now has 27 members, 27, no more 28 because of the Brexit of Great Britain. So it is somehow logical that the European Union makes proposals, indirect, to neighbors of the European Union that are not, maybe not yet members of the European Union. But the problem with the European Union's proposal of a closer association with Ukraine is that this proposal is different for the very simple reason that Russia perceives this proposal as, rightly or wrongly, that's not a question, as a larger strategy aiming at what? Aiming at increasing the presence of the Western world in what Russia considers to be its near abroad. And this is all the more so, this perception is all the more so true because since the various Central and Eastern European states that were part of the former Soviet bloc throughout the Cold War, these Central and Eastern European states not merely are members or became members of the European Union, they also became members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the majority of them first were members of NATO before becoming members of the European Union. And here we have to remind that one of the somehow at least implicit promises that the West, George Bush, father, Helmut Kohl, François Mitterrand, at the end of the 1980s, the very beginning of the 1990s, one of the promises that were made to the then Soviet leader Gorbachev was that in the case of an end of the Cold War, NATO would not enlarge eastwards. NATO would not profit from this situation in order to integrate new members. That is to say, the former so-called popular democracies, not integrating them in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was to some extent the promise which convinced Gorbachev to accept the unification of Germany in October 1990, that is to say, less than 1 year after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there is a kind of mistrust that characterizes Russia's perception. Mistrust consisting in Russia perceiving every move from the West as being eager to diminish the influence of Russia in its near abroad. Russia perceives the moves of the West as a willingness to surround Russia with unfriendly states. And this, of course, was corroborated, this perception was corroborated when the West actively supported the government that came to power after Yanukovych had to escape in February 2014. And to some extent, this contributes to explain what happened in March in Crimea. Given the presence of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the decision to annex Crimea was a signal to the West. You don't go further. Stop, please. I will not accept any move of the Western alliance closer to my Russian border. So let there be, ladies and gentlemen, no misunderstanding. I'm not favorable. I do not support Putin's annexation of Crimea, of course. I do not accuse the Western leaders to have favored this annexation. What I would like to emphasize is that Putin's reaction, notably regarding Crimea and also in the Donbas region, Putin's reaction could and maybe should have been anticipated by the Western governments, for the very simple reason that as early as in the 1990s, any attempt, the then decision to integrate Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, etc., to NATO was criticized. The decision was criticized by he who had been at the origin of America's containment strategy during the Cold War, that is to say, Mr. X, George Kennan, the American diplomats at the American embassy in Moscow at the end of the 1940s, who sent this long telegram to the then US Secretary of State, Marshall, at the origin of the containment strategy rather than the rollback strategy. George Kennan published an article in the New York Times on February 5, 1997. This is the title of the article, A Fateful Error. A Fateful Error. He commented on the decision of NATO to enlarge and to integrate Eastern European states. Expanding NATO, I quote, would be at that time. It did not take place. It had not yet taken place. It was to take place a little bit later. Expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy. Such a decision may be expected to inflame in 1990s the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion. It may have, this decision, an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy. Putin came to power a bit later. Russia is little impressed with American assurances that it reflects no hostile intentions. Of course, America has no hostile intentions when integrating Poland, etc., to NATO. But Russia would nevertheless see their prestige, and he emphasizes in Russian mind, prestige is always important. The Russians, would see their prestige and their security interests affected. So Kennan, who knew what the Russian mind was all about, since he had been in Russia as an ambassador, as a member of the American embassy, he warns in 1997 that Russia would not accept any move eastwards, any move of NATO eastwards. So what I would like to emphasize when referring to Kennan is what I consider to be the mistake, the political mistake committed by the West, the Western statesmen, who forgot to some extent that international politics is power politics, or at least they forgot that this is how Putin perceives international politics. For Putin, who is a realist or a real politician, influenced by and practicing realist strategies, international politics is power politics. And just look at document number 3 on in the file on Moodle. Russia refuses what it perceives, rightly or wrong, as an attempt of the Americans and of the West more generally to impose their will upon Russia. The error, the mistake committed by the West, consisted in somehow believing what Fukuyama had said, that is to say, we will move towards the end of history, Western values will prevail everywhere in the world, there is no alternative ideology, etc. For Russia, this is the proof of the willingness of the US and of the West to dominate. There is no such universal trend towards what Fukuyama called the end of history. There is nothing natural in Western values and Western style regimes spreading over the rest of the world. For Russia, the West only wants to dominate. And since Russia itself wants to dominate what it considers to be its near abroad, the end result is what it always used to be in the past: Eastern Europe, the Balkans, Poland, and nowadays Ukraine, and maybe tomorrow Belarus will be logically the playground of the power political game opposing the Western powers, and nowadays the US, to Russia. Russia, after the 1990s, recovered a fairly significant part of its material economic resources. It no longer, when Putin came to power, accepted to do what the Western asked it to do. It became more assertive. And as proven already in Georgia, it no longer accepted what it perceived as the Western domination. The reaction of the West, of the Western statesmen, Obama, Hollande, Merkel, was the following one. They did not hesitate to qualify, to define Putin's behavior as old-fashioned. That is to say, as a kind of characteristic, as a kind of behavior characteristic of the 19th century, pre-World War I behavior. I think that they were wrong. They were wrong, politically speaking. They may be right from a human rights point of view. They may be right from an ethical, moral point of view, but they are wrong from a political point of view for the very simple reason that politics, and this is what Machiavelli already said 5 centuries ago, politics obeys its own rules. It should not be analyzed, looked at through moral or ethical looking glasses. Putin's tough guy approach to Ukraine is rooted in his desire to guarantee Russia's security, to maximize what he considers to be Russia's security. Remember Kenneth Waltz, what are states looking for on the international scene, characterized by anarchical structure, by the absence of any authority telling states what to do and what not to do? Well, according to Kenneth Waltz, in anarchy, security, I quote, is the highest end. Only if security is guaranteed, states can look for other objectives, prosperity, etc., tranquility, power. The goal anarchy encourages states to pursue. This goal is security. So Putin's argumentation is the following one, based on his perception. According to Putin, Western powers want to profit from the domestic troubles in Ukraine, 2013, 2014. Western statesmen want to profit from these troubles. To do what? To integrate a pro-Western Ukraine into the European Union and also into NATO. According to Putin, the Western powers claim that their aims, that their objectives are merely economic, merely defensive. But according to Russia, according to Putin, in the case Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union and all the more so of NATO, the European Union and NATO will reach the Russian border. And thus, the Russian security will be at stake. Remember that the Russians were invaded in the past, the Russians and the Soviets, from the West. At least during the last centuries. Napoleon, Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany. What did the Soviets do after 1945? They maintained the Red Army, who had liberated the Eastern European states in the Eastern European states. And for them, it was a defensive move. The Western leaders at that time had not accepted this interpretation. They considered the fact for the Soviets to maintain the Red Army in the eastern part of Germany, in Poland, in the then Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, etc., as the proof of the Soviet expansionism. And therefore, they established NATO as a defensive move. So to some extent, Putin nowadays exactly acts like the West acted in the 1940s, at the end of the 1940s, beginning of the 1950s. For the then Western powers, the Russian behavior was not defensive. For today's Russia, the Western behavior consisting in integrating potentially Ukraine to NATO is anything but defensive. It is their Russian security which is at stake. And in document number 4, in the file on Moodle, you will find the details of Russia's perception of NATO. So Putin, therefore, did not hesitate to annex Crimean Peninsula and to support militarily the rebels in the Donbas region, because he considers that Russia's security is at stake. And Russia's behavior here is also influenced by the past of Russia when dealing with its outside world. Russia's history, or at least the interpretation, the mainstream Russian interpretation of the Russian history, emphasizes that ever since, I would say, the last 10 centuries or so, Russia was regularly invaded by foreign powers. First of all, the Mongol invasion during the 13th century. The Mongols invaded the then Kievan Russia, the Russia whose capital was Kiev, today's Ukraine. Kiev, which therefore is considered somehow as the cradle of contemporary Russia. Therefore, we can establish a kind of parallel with Serbia, whose cradle is Kosovo, where the struggle, the war took place with the Ottomans trying to invade the Balkans, invading actually the Balkans. So the Mongol invasion of the 13th century, Moscow at that time was a small princedom. It became Russia's capital only 2 centuries later. Russia, second invasion by the entity at that time composed by the Polish and the Lithuanians. And if you go to the Red Square in Moscow, you'll find a statue of the two Russian heroes, an aristocrat and a butcher, as far as I remember, who launched the resistance against the Polish-Lithuanian invader during the 17th century. Napoleon attacked Russia at the very beginning of the 19th century, and World War I and World War II, Imperial Germany and then Nazi Germany invaded Russia. So according to the Russian interpretation of the Russian history, Russia must practice what it calls a kind of defensive imperialism. A defensive imperialism, that is to say, it must expand territorially, or at least control territories very close to it, and therefore it must remain an empire, imperialism, in order to be able to defend itself. That said, of course, Putin is not merely guided by defensive motivations. If you carefully listen to his political discourses, all the more so during the last 10 years or so, he goes on considering, ladies and gentlemen, the breakup of the Soviet Union. The breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 as, I quote, the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. For today's post-Soviet Russia, the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. He very regularly makes allusions in his discourse to what he calls Nova Russia, the new Russia. The new Russia, which actually is also a historical Russia, because it is a term that had been used by the Tsars in the 19th century. The 18th century, the Nova Russia is part of the territory which precisely goes from the Black Sea, today's Donetsk, the city of Donetsk in the Donbas region, to Odessa, the city in the very west of Ukraine, very close to Moldavia. That is to say, today's Moldavia, independent, and also today's Romania. So a region which roughly corresponds to the Russian populated southern part of Ukraine. In other words, he's also guided by an offensive motivation. And Putin's objectives, therefore, if we add the security defensive motivation that we already mentioned, Putin is motivated by, I would say, the three major objectives pursued by states who have a power political conception of international politics. The three objectives were perfectly summed up by Raymond in his Peace and War. He was influenced by Hobbes, he was influenced by Thucydides. Listen to Raymond summing up the three objectives that states may look for and regularly do look for on the international scene. What is the first objective? I quote, that a political unit, the state, may look for. The response is furnished by Hobbes, so he refers to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Each political unit aspires to survive. This is what Waltz said. Every entity makes security the first objective. Security is the first objective. Aron agrees with Kenneth Waltz. But, and here then he comes to the second objective, collective units do not only look for security, they do not want only to enjoy peace, they seek to be strong. They seek to be strong, to be fed, to be respected, to be admired. If you look at document number 3, Putin twice uses the expression respect. Respect prevailed among the winners of World War II, and therefore the Cold War was a stable order, and Russia wants to be respected. So states want not merely security and peace, they also want to be strong, in order to be feared, admired, or respected. They seek to be powerful. The second objective is power, in order to impose their will upon their neighbors, upon their rivals. The two objectives are connected, I go on quoting. Security can be a final goal, but power too can be a final objective. And I would like to add a third objective, glory. To be complete, I, Raymond, add glory. Glory derives from the self-esteem, amour-propre, French expression, also in the English translation of the book. Glory derives from the amour-propre that animates men, and therefore states, once they compare themselves against each other, once they measure themselves, they want glory. And Aron gives examples taken from the French history. Clemenceau, ladies and gentlemen, what was he looking for? Security, power, glory? He was looking for security. World War I, Germany invaded France, so Clemenceau was looking for security. The first example is Clemenceau's search for security. Napoleon, ladies and gentlemen, what was he looking for? Power, since he wanted to establish an empire, dominating the rest of Europe. And Louis XIV, the third example, historical, empirical example given by Raymond. Louis XIV was looking for the glory of France. He was the Sun King, the glory of France, or his own glory, of course. So the three motivations. Putin, ladies and gentlemen, to some extent embodies the three objectives that were pursued by these three different French leaders. He is guided by the three motivations. Three motives at the same time. First, he wants to guarantee Russia's security, and therefore he wants no expansion of NATO integrating Ukraine. He also wants, of course, to recover the past power of Russia and of the Soviet Union, and therefore he is interested in recovering important parts of the former Russian Tsarist and Soviet Empire, or at least, since this is hardly possible, he at least wants to control what is happening in its near abroad. And in doing so, he does not act that differently from what America is doing in its backyard, in its Latin American backyard, from the Rio Grande to Argentina. And he's not acting that differently from France, ladies and gentlemen, is doing in its African précaré. And last but not least, he is eager, of course, to try to re-establish Russia's prestige, Russia's reputation, status, reputation. And since Russia has no soft power, he cannot but resort to hard power. That is to say, to his physical strength, in order to prove that Russia should deserve respect, to quote his own term. So the behavior of Russia regarding in interfering in the Ukrainian crisis is anything but surprising. If we look at it through realist glasses and looking glasses, and I think we should, because Putin himself is driven by a realist conception of international politics. And if you take into account this realist approach, you will not at all be surprised by his behavior. When I was a student, ladies and gentlemen, of course, during the Cold War, my teachers ascribed the then expansionist behavior of the Soviet Union, of the then communist Soviet Union, to precisely the communist regime. It was a kind of liberal analysis, you know that. According to the liberal approach in international relations, the foreign policy of a state reflects the domestic regime. So the behavior on the international scene of the Soviet Union, be it its expansionist behavior in Africa, in Afghanistan in 1879, in Cuba when it supported Fidel Castro, and first and foremost in its immediate neighborhood, that is to say the then Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, when it repressed Hungary in 1956, when it incited Eastern Germany to erect the Berlin Wall in 1961, when it intervened militarily in Czechoslovakia in 1968, when it incited the Polish army to put an end to the Solidarność experience in 1981, my teachers ascribed what happened to the communist regime. If this analysis were right, since Putin is not a communist, he should not behave this way. And yet, he behaves roughly the same way as the Soviet Union had done. In its near brow, Russia is exactly acting as the Soviet Union, which was exactly acting as the former Tsarist empire. Remember the Holy Alliance, the alliance formed after 1815, composed by Prussia, Austria, and Russia. What was the aim of these three, at that time, conservative regimes? To maintain order in their territories and in the different units that they were directly or indirectly controlling already in Eastern Europe. What does that mean? This means that there is a continuity in the foreign policy of the different states, and in this case of Russia. Just as Putin nowadays wants to control Georgia, wants to control Ukraine, the Tsarist Empire expanded southwards and eastwards. Look at the names that they gave to the city created in the Caucasus, Vladikavkaz. Vladikavkaz means the ruler of the Caucasus, the Russian ruler. Vladivostok in the Far East on the Pacific Ocean. Vladivostok, the ruler of the East. So there is a continuity. And this continuity, ladies and gentlemen, is what characterizes international politics according to the realist Hans Morgenthau. Continuity because statesmen of whatever domestic regime, of whatever political ideology, are driven, are guided by one objective, the national interest, be it defined in terms of security or power, or even the prestige. Listen to Hans Morgenthau. We assume, we posit the hypothesis that statesmen think and act in terms of the national interest. They think and they act in terms of the national interest. The evidence of history proves the validity of this hypothesis. The concept of interest, national interest, is to this, creates that astonishing continuity, that surprising, but it's not surprising actually, continuity in foreign policy, which makes, and here are his examples, which makes American, British, and Russian foreign policy appear by and large consistent continuity, regardless of the different successive statesmen, whoever will be the statesman, whatever will be his ideological, political, philosophical beliefs or convictions or ideas, he will practice one and the same foreign policy based on the search of the state's national interest. The Ukrainian-Russian crisis or conflict, or Russia's behavior in this conflict, absolutely corroborates the validity of this analysis. Putin acts like the Soviet leaders who acted like the Tsarist leaders. And the Ukrainian-Russian crisis conflict also proves the validity, corroborates another realist claim when it comes to the links of economy and politics. Some minutes ago, I referred to Obama, to Merkel, to Hollande, criticizing Putin's old-fashioned behavior when annexing Crimea, when helping the rebels, the secessionists in the Donbas region. By using this term old-fashioned, they, unconsciously or not anyway, referred to the liberal doctrine, the liberal theory, according to which in today's economically globalized world, interdependent world, to go to war is old-fashioned, is no longer rational, is counterproductive. And in doing so, they alluded to Montesquieu's, the French Montesquieu's du commerce thesis. The du commerce thesis, trade not invade, is the English equivalent, according to which peace, I quote Montesquieu, is the natural effect of trade. The peace is the natural effect of trade. According to Montesquieu, two nations who have trade with one another would be foolish to go to war against each other, since they need each other. One state is selling goods to the other one, which is buying goods from the first one, and vice versa. So there's a kind of mutual interdependency, and they would be foolish, irrational if they went to war, because by doing so, they will interrupt the trade, which profits the rest of their population. Economic trade, and in nowadays world economic interdependence, makes war irrational. It's the same argument put forward by liberals, I already mentioned it, when looking at the Chinese-American economic interdependence. So war becomes obsolescent, and therefore those who go to war belong to the past. They are old-fashioned. Obviously, Putin is not very fond of Montesquieu. Otherwise, he would not have invaded or annexed Crimea. He would not have sent troops and weapons to the rebels. Why? Because in doing so, his economy is suffering due to economic sanctions that were adopted by the Western states, by the Western governments. Obviously, Putin prefers political objectives to economic rationality. He prefers political objectives, be they the security, be they the power, be they the prestige of Russia, to the economic well-being of his own population. In other words, he is an adherent of the realist claim according to which foreign policy is high politics, whereas the economic well-being is low politics. And in doing so, he once again corroborates the realist approach. And this is exactly to some extent what Trump is doing when putting an end to the free trade with China, when adopting protectionist policies. His political aims, America's independence, or America's absence of dependence from products coming from China, is more important than the well-being of the American population profiting from the low prices of China-produced goods. So Putin's behavior corroborates the realist approach according to which economy is hardly important when it comes to political passions, to political objectives. And this approach is even indirectly corroborated, indirectly joined, should I say, by not necessarily the liberal trade not invade thesis, but the more general liberal philosophy. And I here refer to Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, in his Perpetual Peace, a sketch, put forward three conditions that, according to him, must be fulfilled in order for peace to prevail in democratic regimes, international institutions, and what he calls cosmopolitanism. That is to say, there must be universally shared values to some extent. And according to, not universally shared values, transnational ties in the economic domain, in the commercial domain, transnational ties among people, that is to say, among members of the various civil societies, which therefore end up sharing the same values and are no longer loyal, first and foremost, to their national governments. If such transnational ties emerge, then members of the civil society, and pretty often economic actors, because they have ties with other economic actors in other civil societies, in this case, economic links are favorable to peace. If you look at the ties between, to say it very concretely, Western businessmen and Russian businessmen, no such transnational solidarity exists. The oligarchs, the Russian oligarchs, I come back to the term, the Russian ones, not the Ukrainian ones, do invest in the city of London. They purchase luxury estates at the French Côte d'Azur. They purchase with their money football teams, Chelsea, etc. But the chief executive officers of Gazprom, of Rosneft, the big Russian multinational firms in the domain of raw materials, are not acknowledged, I would say, as legitimate members of the gentlemen's clubs composed by Western businessmen holding MBAs, Masters of Business Administration from Harvard, from HEC in France, from the London Business School. There is no spontaneous sympathy, personal ties, and therefore, or because of, it's mutually co-constitutive, of course, therefore, or because of they are close to Putin. There is no transnational, Marxists would say, capitalist class that includes the Russian businessmen, and I think the same is true with the Chinese businessmen, who are not perceived to be the same kind of businessmen as the British, the Americans, the Germans, the Japanese, and the French ones, by these last Western businessmen. And therefore, economic sanctions, the vicious circle of economic sanctions and counter-sanctions, ends up worsening the political rivalry and the economic links which exist. Russia has economic links, notably with Germany, with Italy, because of its exports of gas. These economic links do not permit peace to resist to, I would say, important, significant political rivalries. Anyway, Russia's behavior, ladies and gentlemen, this is my core point, was predictable. This does not mean, nevertheless, that we are heading towards a new Cold War. I don't think so. The term Cold War was used by various Russian politicians. The former head of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, used it in 2014, 2015. Medvedev, the former prime minister, then president, now again prime minister of Putin, also used this term when alluding precisely to the behavior of NATO, which he considers to be unfriendly. I quote, "We have slid back," I quote him, "to a new Cold War. My conclusion here will be much more optimistic from a Western point of view, not from a Russian point of view, of course. Then my analysis will be more optimistic. I do not think that there will be a new Cold War, for the very simple reason that Russia, precisely because it is resorting to hard power, since it has no soft power, precisely because it has to resort to hard power, proves, despite itself, that it is a poor power. It is a poor power. The term was coined by the French historian of Russian origin, Georges Sokolov, in a book that was published immediately after the end of the Cold War, La Puissance Pauvre, the Poor Power History of Russia, from 1815 to nowadays, the beginning of the 1990s, a bit less than 30 years ago. What was the aim of Sokolov? He was eager to understand what absolutely nobody at that time had expected, anticipated, the very sudden and brutal collapse of the Soviet Union. Since, maybe I mentioned this point already when I was a student, all my teachers, very brilliant ones, emphasized what they called the irreversible nature of the Soviet totalitarian regime. That is to say, they expected that the Soviet Union sooner or later would invade Western Europe. And then, within some weeks, the Berlin Wall came down, and 2 years later, no more USSR. So everybody was surprised, and everybody was trying to look for an explanation. How can we explain that this supposedly huge, powerful Soviet Union collapsed very quickly and unexpectedly? His analysis then is the following one. Russia, basically, the Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Russia, and nowadays I added this, Putin's Russia, are basically poor, were and are a poor power. That is to say, it establishes a very huge military apparatus on a very weak economic basis. And since it resorts to hard power in order to exert constraint, coercion, punishment, this precisely proves that it has nothing to seduce, to co-opt, to attract. In other words, Russia structurally is weak. And if you look at its GDP, it is the same as Italy's GDP. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Italian, so I know what I'm talking about. Would you consider Italy as a major power? No, of course not. So despite the huge military apparatus of Russia, economically it is so weak that it is absolutely unlikely to challenge neither America's existing order nor the rise of China as the prospective future major power. In other words, there is no Cold War. There is no new Cold War characterizing the Russian-American relationship. Russia is basically weak, economically speaking. Demographically, it is declining. Russia is not, ladies and gentlemen, a major power. Thank you very much for listening to today's class. I wish you a great day, and I hope you'll be back in 2 weeks after the holidays for our chapter number 8. Goodbye.